we're recording now. It's Monday, 2 days after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And as I was thinking about this conversation we're going to have, I immediately sort of started, well, not panicking, but being like, my God, Yuval's book is about the Constitution, and we're talking about, real sort of civic decay and the fraying of our fabric. But then, of course, I remembered that that's exactly what your book's about. So it's actually a really good time to talk about it. I guess say a few words about, where you were the moment, as you sort of started writing this book. And I guess my question is, how much worse has it gotten since you started writing the book, or you still feel like we're more or less in the same place where we were when you were, inspired to start writing the book?
Well, in some ways, I think we're in more or less the same place, but it's a dark place. I was moved to write this book by a long-term project of thinking about the condition of American institutions, which has been my work more or less for the last 10 years. Before that, I was really a policy wonk. I worked on healthcare and budget issues and the kinds of things we normally do at a place like the American Enterprise Institute. And somewhere around 2012 or so, in thinking about why it was so hard to have traditional public policy debates in Washington, I started to think more about the condition of our political culture and ultimately the condition of our institutions. Thinking first about culture, I tried to ask myself where the fragmentation and polarization and breakdown of consensus had come from, and I wrote a book in 2016 on that subject called The Fractured Republic. The trouble with that kind of argument is that it is diagnostic. To say that the problem is cultural is to say that I don't know what to do about it, because change the culture is not a very workable prescription. And when you try to think about, well, what can I do about a problem that is cultural, you almost automatically end up talking about institutions. You talk about things you can do where you are, in your family, in your work, in your community, in your school, in your church. And those are all institutions. And Americans, we tend to be pretty bad at thinking about institutions in their own terms. And so that led me to the next book I wrote, which was published in 2020, called A Time to Build, which is really about how to think about institutions and how to understand the problems of contemporary America through the lens of institutions. And thinking in those terms and applying them to the work I do every day, which is still a lot of public policy and institutional reform work, led me to think about the American Constitution, which I've come to see as, in some important respects, a framework for national unity, for addressing the kinds of problems that a divided society has. And ultimately, I think the Constitution is a framework for social peace, which is why I do think that this book, whether it was meant to be or not, is a way of thinking about the challenges we face in this moment, because the threat to social peace, and frankly, the tendency we have to take for granted social peace and think that we can attack the weaknesses of our society without taking care to guard its core achievement, which is the fact that we are a vast, diverse society at peace with itself, is a characteristic mistake of 21st century America. We all know what's wrong with liberalism now, but we don't think about what's right with it, which is that we live with immense diversity in relative peace. And I think in forgetting that, we put it at risk. And so this is a time to reacquaint ourselves with the promise of the American Constitution as a framework for cohesion and for peaceful coexistence. And that's what the book is about. It's not about civility. It's not about tone and rhetoric. It's about institutional structures that make it possible for us to act together even though we're not going to think alike. A very hard thing to do, which I think our system of government is exceedingly good at doing if we let it.
Mm. The part that I found I kept coming sort of back to and wrestling with throughout the book is this question of we that is at the core of it.
Yeah.
And you're interpreting Madison how he basically both melds an optimistic and a pessimistic view of human nature and of what constitutes a people, and creates this constitutional framework in a sense to build this we that it is. And it's one of the things that, I found it phrased different ways in the book. And I guess this is a question for you, and I guess for Madison as well. It's both assuming that the we exists and then creating a structure to realize it, but still there's a requirement of some sort that there is something there at the core,
right,
to be even able to build it and sustain it over a long sort of path, a long history of that really is America's history. I guess let me push you a little bit on that, on where the we comes from and this question of willing it into being versus it being there.
Yeah.
And this gets at, I think what you were alluding to in your answer just now, this question of, culture, of political culture. So I don't know, take that wherever you like.
I think one of the most brash, almost outrageous acts of the American founding is the assertion that there is a we. We is a really important word in our political tradition. It's the first word of the Constitution. It's the first word of that incredible second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths. And you have to wonder in that moment, who was we? There's an equally brash kind of assertion at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence where it says that there are moments in world history where one people has to separate from another. And you want to say, well, wait a minute, you're already one people? Isn't that the whole point of this thing? The claim they make to be one people is very interesting. And I do think that it is aspirational to begin with, that the Constitution acknowledges that. It says that its first purpose is to form a more perfect union, which certainly suggests that it took itself to be addressing an imperfectly united people. And the Constitution would not have been necessary if that were not the case. It was there because they were having trouble holding together. And of course, there's also a kind of dark compromise at the core of the Constitution, an implicit agreement to limit who we mean by we and to exclude Black Americans and others. In order to be able to compromise toward a we, they narrowed that we, and American history has been in large part an effort to broaden it after that. But I do think that the system they set up is capable of broadening and sustaining that we in a pretty extraordinary way, that it is there to make it possible for a people who are not of one mind to be one people. And there, I think it is really Madison's insight is, as you say, the mix of optimism and pessimism that says that we're always going to disagree with each other, but that doesn't mean that we are not one people. And that unity doesn't have to mean thinking alike, that unity is about action. It is about acting together, maybe especially when we don't think alike. That's what politics is for. I think that we would be wise to remind ourselves of that presumption, that it means that cohesion is more possible than we imagine when we just take notice of how divided we are. There's much more to work with here than that. But it also means that the we at the heart of our political tradition is always aspirational. And it is a question, not an assertion to begin with. I think that's still true. It's true every day. And it's obvious in our time that there's work to be done for us to say we and mean the American people as a whole.
So I love what you just said about we being the first word of the Constitution. I love a close read generally. And in some ways, it almost feels like your book is a close read of the Constitution, framing the institution through the words, through the original framers' statements. And I find that fascinating, but I also, and maybe this is the non-optimistic question, I wonder if our polity has the stomach for that anymore. I mean, if you read Madison's work, if you read your book, yes, there's this discussion of a we, there are these assumptions made. Is the average American actually doing that? Is the average American thinking deeply about, creating a we through a certain institution as it was, hoped for by the founders, or is the we that we now focus on today something entirely different, something entirely unrelated to those institutions? Because I just think about actually the many sort of either propaganda pieces or like bits of merch from, different political campaigns where it's like a low resolution picture of the Constitution, but no one's actually reading that. It's not like they're affiliating themselves around the Declaration of Independence. It's a tribal signifier emptied of its content.
This is a great question, and it occurred to me in the midst of writing this book that I was doing something bizarrely Jewish with the Constitution. I was treating it as a text that is meant to frame a way of life, and that's not simply what the Constitution is. It's not what it is for everybody. It's not what it's ever been for everybody. The Constitution is law. It's also a kind of framework of rules. But I do think that it describes a way of life when read a certain way. Now, that reading is never going to be everybody's vocation. It's not going to be how everybody thinks about how to live as an American citizen. But I think that there is an insight that I at least draw out of it that implies that the habits we have in politics are functions of the structures of our institutions. So that to think about the text as framing institutions and practices is also to think about it as building civic habits. And it does. The Constitution builds our civic habits. There are ways, there are things about being an American that are functions of the Constitution. The sense we have that there are rights we're entitled to, the sense we have that there's a process and a procedure that has to somehow be neutral in resolving disputes, the idea that we respond to problems by forming committees. These are very American things. They're very strange things. And I think they have a lot to do with the imprint of our constitutional tradition on us. We have an advantage that the framers of the Constitution didn't have, which is that we have a history and a tradition of living under the system they created. So they had to be much more explicit about it. They had to go through the text. George Washington's copy of the Constitution, which they have on display at Mount Vernon, has the word president written next to every part of the Constitution that applies to the president's job. So when he was elected, he just went through it and tried to figure out what his job was. Obviously, our presidents don't do that now, and we don't do it either. But because the document allows for that kind of approach, it's created habits, precedents, not only for judges, but for citizens and for anyone who has recourse to the system as a system that I think are very important. And to understand those requires, I think, a kind of close reading. I don't imagine that everybody will do this or that everybody would draw from it what I would draw from it. But I think that the practice of doing that in moments when we become uncertain about what this system has to offer us, and I think we are in such a moment now, can remind us about the fundamentals in ways that are very useful. I think the very idea that the Constitution is there to unify a divided people is unfamiliar to most people who think about the Constitution. It's not the obvious thing about it, and we treat it now as a kind of lawyer's tool or judge's tool. It's law, fundamentally, and it is law, but it's also a way to think about exactly the problem that we have, the problem of how to hold together a diverse society. And so I think now and then a reacquaintance with it as a text is worthwhile, even if it won't be how everybody comes to know it.
I really like that in the book, and I like how you just said this too about building civic habits. And, it just makes me think of, so many annoying self-help treatises, which is just, to become healthy, do healthy things, routines, yes. Right? And it's, or more traditionally minded, virtue is cultivated through, virtuous rituals and just sort of repetition of that sort. But, it's still, to maybe build a little bit on what Christine is saying, it's in your book as well, this point that we've come to a place where rather than turning to the Constitution as a source of these kinds of virtuous rituals that we should practice to be able to create a people, we've come to see it as, across the partisan divide as a set of limitations on what, we hope to do.
Yeah.
So it's, rather than revering the text at this point, we're pushing against it and abrading against it all the time. The criticisms that the text itself is hidebound, it's not getting in the way. And I mean, you do a really good job explaining why these are, in fact, many of the virtues of the thing. But to build on Christine's question then, how do we restore maybe that kind of reverence? Because that's necessary. Maybe it's not that, we as a people have the habits, we as a Twitter-addled people have the patience to read really, as you point out, a pretty short text, but nevertheless, 7,000 words of legalese. How do we restore that? That again, it's a sort of chicken egg problem about how do you restore that virtue?
I was thinking that Yuval was going to make like a TikTok series, a sort of like wellness routine around the Constitution, like the liberalism book that we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I'll leave that to someone else. But I think it's a very important question because it forces us to ask how the text comes to be translated into practice, but also how we understand what it's for. The Constitution is, in some respects, a set of limits, and especially as law, it is a set of limits. But part of what I want to convey is that the Constitution is not just law, and that it's not just for lawyers. And in all of the other ways beyond law that it approaches us, it is not a set of limits. So it approaches policymakers as a set of powers. The Constitution created a government that didn't exist before that could do things that Americans couldn't do before with their governments. They wanted it because they needed a better government that was more effective and efficient, and that's what they created. It also, I think, creates a kind of political culture that makes possible all kinds of things that weren't possible before. And my approach to these things is a little bit like Chesterton's fence in the book. I think there are all kinds of weird things about the Constitution that we now think of as just limits. They're just fences that prevent us from going somewhere we want to go. And there's a tendency to want to tear them down, and it's not just on one side of our politics or another. And I think before we do that, we should make sure we understand why they are there. And again, when you ask yourself, why is this there? You realize that it's there for a very sophisticated reason that still applies. It is still necessary to balance majority rule and minority rights, for example. And this is very hard to do. So the Constitution does this in ways that are extremely frustrating to narrow majorities in our politics. Every recent president has sat in the Oval Office in a meeting with people and just thinking, didn't I just win the election? Why the hell am I talking to these people? And the answer it comes from the Constitution and says, yeah, but they won an election too, and they're still here, and they're not going anywhere, and you have to deal with them. That's actually a distinct feature of American democracy. The Prime Minister of Britain can do everything he wants as long as he has a majority in Parliament. The entire government is at his feet. The President of the United States can barely do anything at all, and nothing's at his feet. He has won, by winning the election, a seat at the table, and what happens at the table is bargaining and negotiating and haggling. And our system forces us to do that because it recognizes that majority rule can be oppressive, which is very hard for democracies to conceive of. We ask ourselves, why do we elect our presidents in these totally ridiculous ways? And there's no way to look at the Electoral College and not find it absurd. And yet, the kinds of critiques that come of it also often are these kind of comparative arguments that say, well, why don't we just have a direct election and a more proportional system like they do here or there? But when you actually look around the world, other democracies elect their chief executives in much less democratic ways than we do, right? The British just had an election. The last election was 4 years earlier, and in the course of those 4 years, they had 3 prime ministers. Where did these people come from? They were chosen by a very small group of people who all share the same political interest and went to the same 2 universities. But the reason they do that is so that there's not a direct election of a chief executive to avoid demagogues. We still have that problem. We still have to solve that problem, and we solve it in a more democratic way than most democracies. Once you look at each of these institutions in that way, some of them certainly need some reform. Some of them are there for reasons that have to be argued about now. But they're all there for reasons that have to do with finding a balance between essentially a government that is too tyrannical and a government that is too rabidly mobocratic. the Americans, when they wrote the Constitution, had gone through a very unusual experience of first fighting a war against a government they took to be oppressive, and then living with state governments that were plainly ineffective and inefficient. And they learned that government is dangerous and necessary. And bringing that lesson into the process of writing a constitution allowed them, I think, to reach some balanced conclusions and design choices that should still impress us. And they still do impress me. So I think the arguments for those kinds of things are some of the most complicated things you have to do now if you're defending the constitutional system. But by telling them as historical narratives and trying to see them through the eyes of the really quite intelligent people who produce this, I think we can help ourselves grasp what they are before we reach for the before we reach for the tractor and pull them out.
Mm.
Well, on that note, let's dive into a couple of those institutions. Obviously, some of them are quite topical right now. So maybe let's turn to the presidency, actually. You describe the ambivalent power of the executive branch. And I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by that. And also maybe what you think about I don't want to make you comment directly on past presidents or, current administrations, but that ambivalence, the idea that the executive shouldn't do everything, to me feels a little bit like it's waned, at least in popular understanding. Is that something you see?
Very much so. I think the presidency was the great innovation of the Constitution. There'd never really been anything quite like it because it is a Republican chief executive at a national level. There'd been kings, and in some ways, monarchy is a model for the presidency. There'd been governors of the states, and they were very weak, and in some ways, the presidency is modeled on them too. But in a sense, they needed to be both democratic and efficient. And these are not things that go together, generally speaking. And the presidency, in a sense, the convention faced a basic question. Is the president an elevated head of state, or is the president a chief clerk who just carries out what Congress says? And the answer they came to, as they often did on the most controversial questions they faced, was just yes. The president is both of these opposite things at the same time. And therefore, the job of the president has always been very confusing and contradictory. It is very easy as president to be called too weak and too strong. Because what we expect of the president is both assertive executive leadership and restraint and the enforcement of the laws as they're written. I think that over time, and not just lately, but over 150 years, the role of the president came to be more and more central and assertive in our system. It happened particularly as a result of the United States becoming a global power and having expectations of the president that were not the expectations of the first 5 or 6 American presidents who were basically operating in a kind of provincial backwater at the edge of the world. Once the president had to really be a commanding presence on the world stage, the president of the United States became a different kind of figure than the framers really imagined. And at the same time, as we industrialized, there just came to be a need for administration in our government on a level that also was not, I think, imagined at the end of the 18th century. And the question was whether the ambiguity of the office would allow for flexibility to adapt to these new realities. I think some presidents have done this better than others, but on the whole, the American system has become much more presidential than it was intended to be. And I think by now, it's much more presidential than it should be. Mm-hmm. And it's come at the cost of the weakening of the Congress, which must be the central actor in our system for it to work well. So I would say it's interesting to observe the way in which the left and the right have changed their minds about the president over the last half century or so. The American right went from being very presidentialist, not by coincidence in a period where most presidents were Republican and Congress was controlled by the Democrats, to being increasingly skeptical of presidential power and administrative power. The Chevron deference in the courts, which was just overturned, was a decision written by Antonin Scalia and understood to be very much in the service of a kind of conservative vision of the Constitution. And now overturning it was a decision written by really his successor, Chief Justice Roberts, and understood as serving a conservative vision of the courts. I think the ambiguity of the presidency is why that could be. And the office remains very ambiguous. I think it is also vastly overgrown now, and we have to think about ways of constraining it, which won't be easy.
I mean, since we're talking about the rulings, it was one that I was going to ask you about is the immunity ruling as well, because it tugs in the opposite direction, and it reinforces again the other thing you talked about, which is that the vigor that's necessary in the executive. The thing that as I was digging through trying to understand the ruling myself and talking to colleagues at the Post and people who follow this stuff a lot more closely, I was not fully aware of the extent to which Roberts himself was part of the sort of, judicial, legal clique around George W. Bush. Yeah. And they were making all sorts of arguments back then about the importance of, defending that executive vigor as well. So, is it fair to say that, the role of Roberts is different than any Republican in sort of thinking about this. But is it really true that the conservative position right now is one of having doubts about the executive? Is that hold abroad, like more broadly?
Well, so first of all, I think that's right, that Roberts and also Kavanaugh personally were very involved in the circle around George W. Bush thinking about executive power. And certainly in that circle, in that moment, in the wake of 9/11, there was an intense kind of presidentialism. The kind of presidentialism that emerged from the American Enterprise Institute in the 1980s, really came to fruition through Dick Cheney's influence and other people in the course of the George W. Bush administration. I think that at the same time, there arose a countervailing set of ideas on the right that was concerned about the administrative state. Mm-hmm. And there was some effort to align these two through the idea of the unitary executive that said there can't be an administrative state. All the executive power belongs to the president alone. And in that sense, constraints on executive power are not exactly the same thing as constraints on presidential power. But I do think that the center of gravity on the right has shifted in the direction of constraints on presidential power among legal thinkers on the right. I don't think that'll happen if Donald Trump is elected president. The people around him are not going to be interested in constraints. And they'll find themselves very constrained, by the way, by this court, by decisions like overturning Chevron, which I think renders a lot of Trump's agenda much harder to achieve. I do think the center of gravity has shifted in that way. And yeah, the immunity decision is an exception to that comes from a different tradition of kind of presidentialism. I'm not a huge fan of that decision, and I am, I would say, a huge fan of the broader move away from a focus on presidential power as a way of thinking about how to allow the Constitution to work. The Madisonian view of the Constitution, as opposed to, say, the Hamiltonian view, really emphasizes the centrality of Congress. And I think, broadly speaking, that is where the Roberts Court has shifted power to. A lot of its major decisions shift power back to the democratic process and ultimately legislative power. But there are exceptions, and I think the immunity case is certainly one of them.
So I have a couple questions here. One, I was taken, I wouldn't say altogether positively, by Damir's repeated use of the phrase presidential vigor, which in the current moment is maybe a little bit alarming. You talk in your book, when you're writing about the presidency, about the combination or the balance between energy and stability that the president needs to bring to the office. And I mean, this presidential campaign kind of seems like a direct conflict between energy and stability. I won't make you take a stand on the race, but do you think that one quality is more important than the other in this moment, or has it been different in past moments? And why? And then my second question, and I can also bring this up again later, if we're deferring power, say, away from the executive towards Congress or towards, any other place, this gets back to my earlier question of, does our polity have the stomach for that? You also talk about and the founders talked about the necessities of certain virtues of character and thought that you would need to have to administer government, and we don't seem to be doing well.
And again,
on those.
not to name political names, but especially in the executive, personal virtue is
absolutely
really important. And the one thing, just to build on what Christina was saying, what struck me about and conversations I've been had about the immunity ruling is that it ruled on something that just should never have actually had to have been specified. Yeah. That if you have the kind of virtuous people in that role, you're not supposed to delineate this. And the biggest tragedy of the ruling is not that it ruled one way or the other, but that it had to be ruled at all.
I agree with that, and I think you actually can see in the text of the decision that this was the majority's view too, that they dearly wish they were not deciding this case. And in a sense, they didn't quite decide this case. They sent it back to the lower courts hoping that it might come back in a different form. I think that expresses a form of this regret. I would say a few things. I think, first of all, the character of the president matters more than the character of any individual in our system by far. The presidency is one person. And that idea, what's come to be understood as the unitary executive, I think is just a reading of the first sentence of Article 2 of the Constitution. It just simply says that the executive power is vested in the president. And Congress doesn't work that way. Its vices are spread out across 535 people. The courts do not work that way. And the citizenship does not work that way. The presidency works that way, and that means that character matters in the presidency more than any other office. And I think there's no question that this is the reason to worry about demagogues. It is the reason for the nature of the presidential selection system, which has mostly protected us from the worst kinds of personalities in office, but it has not protected us lately. And there's no doubt that the character problem with Donald Trump is the problem that makes him, in my view, ultimately unfit to be president. And that's not a judgment you would make in the same way about people serving in other branches of government. You might make it for other reasons in other domains, but the character of the president matters enormously. Now, I do think also to your other question that character matters in general. The character of the citizenship matters. And there's no doubt that being a citizen of a republic requires a certain kind of set of virtues. They're not the highest virtues. We don't all have to be philosophers, but it does require a certain kind of responsibility that comes with Republican citizenship. The word responsibility, it actually used to be the case that the Oxford English Dictionary said the word responsibility first appeared in English in Madison's notes on the Constitution. They found an earlier example, which is very inconvenient for me in writing this book, but it's still very early. I mean, he was working to bring in that word to describe the nature of the responsibility, particularly of the president. And what responsibility means is both being accountable for something and taking ownership of it as your own. I think American citizens have to be willing to do that. And part of the problem we face now is that a lot of us approach politics as something other people do badly. And we just complain about them and fold our arms and wait for somebody better to show up. But that somebody has to be us. And if we can't think of public problems as our problems, then our system is not going to work. So that there's no question that in order for any of the kinds of changes of attitude and disposition and practice and habit and institutional structure that I talk about to happen, the public has to recognize the need for them and to be open to the possibility that they might offer solutions. Broadly speaking, I think we're pretty far from that. And getting there requires a kind of education that I certainly don't know how to carry out, but I think it might be helped by a book like this, and that I do know how to do, so there we are. The problem is not a small problem. I think the basic sense people have of what it is to be an American citizen needs to be deepened and broadened before we can make these kinds of changes. And a lot of the people in the system need to see that they're responsible for it. So every member of Congress now will tell you that Congress sucks, that the job is terrible, that their quality of life is low, nothing works. When you say to them, well, what would you change? You're asking them a question they haven't really thought about. And the idea that they could just change it, which they can. They don't need anything. They just need themselves to change the rules of the House and Senate, has not occurred to a lot of members. I think taking ownership of the problems you complain about is a habit we've fallen out of. And we have to remind ourselves that that's what republicanism really means.
But you do have I think, a conservative sensibility at the same time. You push back against the idea, that came up in the progressive era that, against that there's a sense of real reverence to the wisdom in the Constitution that we should respect. I mean, to bring us back to these limits, right?
Yep.
And so, you can change the rules. And, I talking to my friends who are much more to the left of me, to the point of like really sort of hungering for this change, there's an optimism to them that I find just sort of hard to grapple with. Maybe even Christine here among these friends, but I'm not actually thinking of you specifically, Christine. I'm thinking of another friend of ours.
I think.
No, but you are optimistic. We have talked about this too. But there is that in the sort of when you say that people aren't taking responsibility of it. I would say that there's a younger generation who are activist minded, who I would agree with you, haven't thought through the complexity of the problem and the intractability of this, like the nasty element of human nature and how you do build a polity together. But I wouldn't say that they aren't pushing for to make these kinds of far-reaching changes. And in doing so, as you point out, this is a thing that goes back to the progressive era. It's abrading against the sort of the limits of the system that we have.
Right. Like I would even, I mean, maybe you are right about me, Tabir. But I would say that, in fact, one of the reasons why we perhaps don't see as much of this, like taking responsibility and taking action and accountability from citizens, especially younger citizens, is a strongly felt sense that they don't actually have the power to change things anytime soon. Like you can vote all you want, but the Constitution, as you describe it, is in some ways purposefully sclerotic and like doesn't want to be changed. And people in various other parts of the institution are not interested in moving it in any particular direction. In which case, why bother?
So I think part of what it means to take responsibility is actually to take ownership. Not to say, I want to throw this away and I can do better, but to say, this is what we've inherited, there's value in it, there are problems with it, and here's how we would change it. In that sense, I don't just have a conservative sensibility, I'm a conservative. And I think that ultimately we have to work with the world we have and not imagine that we would do better by starting it from scratch. And so to say that we can't change anything because we can't change the Constitution, I think is to throw aside the work involved in actually working in this system and through this system. Because there's a lot you can do without changing the Constitution. I think there's a lot you can do by being an active citizen. And being an active citizen doesn't mean just expressing your opinion, which I think is what a lot of younger Americans, on the right as much as the left, take to be civic engagement. Being an active citizen means being part of some set of institutions that use the power that our Constitution gives to our government. It means being part of the work of a political party or of the work of a local government. It means being somehow willing to be involved in working the various arms and tools of our system. And to be frustrated that intense expressions of opinion are not effective is, I think, to be educated in the limits of expression. But that's not the same as the limits of politics. I think all of us now live with a kind of peculiar, and in part because our lives are so mediated by technology, we live with a peculiar sense of how change has happened in the past. And so we think, for example, about the great reform movements of prior generations, the civil rights movement, which succeeded in transforming American society for the better in a profound set of ways. We think of it as having been a movement that expressed outrage at injustice, and it did do that. But it was fundamentally a movement that inserted itself into the political life of American society and exerted majority power over time by building broad coalitions. The March on Washington was a way to show that you could bring people to the voting booth. And when we now march on Washington, we don't show anything. We just show that we can bring people in one place for one day, and then they disperse again. We don't think about the longer-term work of political change, which ultimately requires the set of skills we now most lack, which is coalition building. Coalition building means working with people with whom you agree about some things, but not all things, to see where each of you might be able to advance some of what matters most to you. We are now historically bad at this. And the institutions that exist for coalition building, the political parties and Congress in particular, and the state legislatures to some extent, are very degraded now. The people in them have lost the sense that their job is coalition building, which is very strange. To run for Congress and not think that your job is to bargain and negotiate and make deals is very strange. What else is your job? But many people who now run for Congress don't think that's their job. The political parties, to be a political party and not imagine that your job is to build the broadest possible coalition is very strange, right? What is your job? But neither of our parties now operates as though its job is to build the broadest possible coalition. And I think to recover that knack for coalition building and to see that that is the only way that real change happens, precisely because we don't trust narrow majorities, we trust broad coalitions, I think is what it would take for real change to be possible.
So tell us where you think that degradation is coming from, actually, because I think we've talked a lot on this podcast about the sort of purity testing that goes on in politics and even at this point, personal friendship.
Yeah.
And yes, that is definitely happening in the political arena. So yeah, what has gone wrong and how can we change it? And also, I guess, related to that, sorry, I keep stacking these questions, but you mentioned getting in and changing institutions. And I think this also perhaps goes back to our question about the presidency and energy versus stability. In this moment, we're seeing a certain level of stability in our presidency and other institutions because they're filled by extremely old people who never leave, which also blocks the possibility of change. Is that a degradation too? Is that something else? Like what's going on?
Yeah, these things are, I think, somewhat related. I think we've lost the knack for coalition building in part as the result of a kind of confusion between expression and action that runs very deep in American life. It's overdetermined, but I think it has a lot to do with technology in the 21st century, with the sense that expressing your view is the equivalent of doing something about it. And part of what that means is that we've come to equate the expression of the right view with the advancement of the right political vision. And coalitions inevitably have to be tolerant of divergent views. If you think that you need a broad majority in order to get something done, then you've got to be willing to put up with people who are only barely on board. And our politics has become very bad at tolerating people who are barely on board. But I think it's not just technology. There is a structural problem in American politics that results from the pervasiveness of primary elections that I think was an unintended consequence of a series of political reforms in the middle of the 20th century that just simply have to be rethought. The primaries are not how the American party system worked until the middle of the 20th century in most places. The parties worked in, frankly, much more elitist ways that came to be intolerable to a lot of people, and it's understandable why that would have been. But the alternative that was chosen was a system that begins every election cycle now by asking the fringes of both parties who they would like to populate the system. The fringes of both parties are the craziest people in America. And to begin every election cycle by asking the craziest people in America, what would you like to see, is nuts. And it results in the politics we have now. If you ask yourself, how did this happen? Just what would happen if you start every year by asking the craziest people you know, what would you like to see this year? And that's where we are. The parties have lost their basic core function of candidate selection. They've turned it over to an essentially random electorate, right? Anybody can vote in the primary. I mean, in my state, in Maryland, anybody, literally anybody, you don't even have to be a member of a party to vote in the primaries. And even if you do, that's not a set of people that it has been selected in any way for their capacity to represent anything. They're just willing to show up. And they tend to be the ideologically purist fringe of the party, the people who least want to see bargaining and accommodation happen in our politics. And those are the things that are meant to happen in our politics. And so we've empowered people whose interests and desires are at odds with the functioning of the system to populate the system. I think that has to change. And a lot of what we're living through now is a failure of the party system. How do we end up with two presidential candidates that neither party is willing to say what it thinks about its own candidate at this point? You can't even get people to just tell you honestly, what do you think about this person? That's a failure of the party system at a very profound level that I think has to be thought through in terms of institutional change. And we have to find a way out of the hole we've dug through the primary system, or else it becomes very hard to imagine how any other constitutional change can happen.
Yuval, is our we somehow exceptional? And the reason I ask it is sort of in a negative way, because you keep coming back to this point about the importance of coalition building. That you can't really. It's always about narrow majorities, but it came up in the book, and it's come up in my mind several times in this conversation. The British model, just as a counterexample, parliamentary sovereignty. It's, to an American mind, it's kind of nuts, but it's a democracy. It's a system that works for better or for, it has flaws, but it right. functions, and it does what the critics of the constitutional system pine for. You win the election, and you just do what you need to, and the parliament literally is the end stop. It's not there aren't these wild checks and balances. It's you pass the legislation, it's done, and then the leader of the parliamentary majority also executes it. So it's the contrast there is fascinating. So is there something about the American we that requires our system? Is our system merely more virtuous, but maybe at the cost of being, less,
effective?
Vigorous?
Yes.
I don't know, effective, because I think effective is in the eyes of the beholder. I think you might say one policy is effective, the other side might say no, but the point is just the ability to do rather than be caught in gridlock.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What about that?
I like this question because there's an unstated and maybe undetected implication under it that has to do with the strengths of our Constitution. To compare ourselves to the European democracies requires ignoring the fact that we are much larger, more diverse, and more complicated than they are. The United States is not like even the United Kingdom, let alone Norway and Belgium and all the places that political scientists love to contrast our political system with. We're much more like India. We're much more like Mexico or Brazil, but we're much better governed than those places are. We are a vast and diverse democracy of a sort that I don't think any of the European systems could handle. And we deal with that in a way that was built to deal with that. The United States, even in 1787, was larger than any European nation. And it is now vastly larger than the kinds of democracies that we, I think, rather carelessly compare ourselves with. We have different problems to deal with than they do. I don't think that means our system is inherently better. I do think it is better suited to us and to our problems. I don't think it's simply ineffective either. When the American system determines to be effective, it can do things that the British cannot do. There is an American flag on the moon. We've done things that are really nuts.
That's true.
But we can't do the normal things as well as the Brits do. And there's no doubt there's a trade-off there. Our politics is much more complex than theirs. And I think for that reason, our system involves a lot more restraint than theirs does. We have a lot less underlying social solidarity, and we have to build it up through a system that restrains majorities until they reach out to others and build broader coalitions. They have to. To get anything done, you just have to. And if you didn't have to, then you wouldn't do it. And I think that assumption just may not be true in Scandinavia, even in the United Kingdom. But I do think it's true in the United States. That doesn't mean our Constitution is perfect. It's far from it. And it was also built by a set of compromises that you couldn't really defend in the abstract. It was made necessary by the particular interests that showed up at the time and that have had a hand in changing the system since. But I take that to mean that this system is adapted to a politics of negotiation and bargaining. And I think it is better adapted to it than the parliamentary system. It's not better adapted to technocratic competence. That is not what we do well here. But there are other things we do very well here.
Mm. And I mean, go ahead if you have. No, I mean, it is that question though, and I guess that's at the core of the debate between, the left and the right in this country, is a sense that on the left you have a feeling that our deficiencies in that technocratic administration is really holding us back.
Yes. This actually really relates to this moment, because I think the progressive frustration with the Constitution, which is quite understandable, has always been that it stands in the way of efficient government action. And I think that it has always understated the requirements of social peace. It has taken for granted a relatively peaceful underlying society that could be ordered by the state. And the Madisonian assumption is much more pessimistic than that. It thinks that keeping some modicum of social peace is more important than solving public problems efficiently. And it is ready to be inefficient in return for also averting the disaster of the breakdown of social peace. I am persuaded by that view. And I think that that's a kind of conservative view in general in modern terms that says that the darker side is more significant than the potential upside in politics, that averting social disaster and civil war is the first and foremost purpose of a system like this. And then we should also make sure that it can solve public problems. Now, the Constitution was intended to be effective, right? I mean, the reason they had a convention was not that they were falling into civil war. It was that they couldn't collect taxes and deliver the mail. They did want a government that worked, but they were also very aware of the need to sustain some degree of legitimacy, and they thought it would be very hard to do in this kind of society.
So how do you think that's going for us? What's your rating on the Constitution's current effectiveness at keeping civil order and peace? I mean, we're recording this, I guess, a couple days after the former president was maybe almost assassinated.
Right.
There has been talk of civil war or some sort of societal breakdown for the past, 6 to 8 years at this point. Things do seem very unsettled. What's going on?
I think the question, one important question is compared to what? And the other is, would we address the problem we have, which certainly does look to me like a breakdown of social peace? Would we best address it by recurring to the logic of the Constitution or by breaking from it? I think a fair amount of the problem we have is the result of a kind of deformation of our constitutional order. The increased centrality of the presidency has raised the stakes of our presidential elections to levels they were never meant to reach. The presidency is just not meant to be this important. And so every election just matters way too much. It means that all federal regulation, all civil rights rules, all kinds of things that affect people very directly actually are at stake in the election in a way that they're not supposed to be, that they're not meant to be by the logic of our system. And in that sense, among others, I think that the constitutional system, the Madisonian logic of it, would serve us better in securing a more peaceful society than a further move in the direction of what I take to be a kind of progressive deformation of the Constitution that wants elections to be absolutely decisive and therefore that ultimately wants to raise the stakes and even to heighten the differences in our politics. I think progressives were more upfront about this early on, and Woodrow Wilson is really worth reading on this front. He's a brilliant political scientist, surely the most brilliant American political scientist of the 19th century. And he saw these problems really clearly, and he openly dismisses the necessity for preserving social peace. He thinks that'll be fine. And his successors among American political scientists, you find this, for example, in the party reforms of the 1950s, basically said there are no ideological divisions in American life. And so we can sharpen the ideological differences between the parties without running the risk of dangerous factionalism. And you look at America in the 1950s, it kind of looks that way, right? The parties were, for somebody to tell you they're a Democrat just told you nothing about them. That meant nothing about their political views. It might have meant that they lived in the South and not in the Midwest. We've reached a point where our ideological differences are much more sordid, both in partisan terms and in geographic terms, and where we have to worry again about what Madison worried about, I think uniquely worried about, which is the danger of factional division in American public life. To me, that's an argument for reacquainting ourselves with the Constitution and seeing where it might help us.
It's just, just as you're saying that, though, the thing that struck me after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump was, partly, it's worth stating that our current president is not the greatest orator, but the address that he gave about unity, which is what we expect the president to do, I'm not sure, I don't know how to express it, that it landed flat in a way that it was surreal. I can't put it any other way. And all of the kind of the last, as Christine mentioned, I mentioned as well, we're 2 days out from the moment. All of the discourse that's happening right now still seems incredibly unreal for all of us who have, lived through any moment of national trial where, we do look to these kinds of sort of assurances and calls to unity. And I can't tell if it's the sclerosis of our current ruling elites that's leading to this kind of sense of this is not cutting it, whether it's something else, but I just feel like we're in a world that's not fully recognizable to me. And maybe that's the thing that's shocked me most since the assassination attempt, that there's something, I wasn't alive for the 60s and that whole tumult. But, I from 9/11, the other things I have been around, and that sense of coming together after this really shocking moment, it feels, I don't know, postmodern in a weird way. Like I'm not really here I don't know if that makes any sense.
We are coming together after this moment. Yes. Like that expectation seems not related to reality at this point.
I agree with that. I have to say, for me, I'm incapable of processing this just like anybody else. But where my head has gone is that there is a sense in which we all approach this moment as observers and not as actors in a very strange way, including political decision makers and politicians kind of waiting around to see what the next act of the show looks like, rather than thinking about what this calls for in terms of action. And that passivity is one of the really strange things about this moment in our politics. I spent a lot of time with politicians, and I have for 25 years, and they all, in the last 10 years maybe, strike me as just bizarrely passive, as never imagining that the question I'm asking them is about what they will do rather than what will happen. And you see that in the kind of paralysis of both parties in a way too, where the parties exist to facilitate collective action. That's what they're for. And here, to take the example of the Democrats, you have a political party that seems to have found itself with a presidential nominee who is not ideal, and there's broad agreement about that in the party, and nobody's really sure what is supposed to happen next. There's not a sense of like, how do we do anything about this? And they may not do anything about it, I think. They may march themselves through an election cycle that I think they could win in this moment by doing something else, and just not do it and just lose. I think that has been part for me of the strangeness of the reaction to the assassination attempt too, where there's just a kind of passivity to the way the president thought about this. And look, he did sit in the Oval Office and say something to the country. I'll give him credit for that, and he said some of the things that I think need to be said, but it's like he's a commentator too. And everybody wants to be a pundit, and nobody wants to be the subject of the commentary. I don't know. Like you say, there's something weirdly postmodern about that. And I'm not sure what would be done about it because I don't feel like I fully understand really what it is that's going on. But I actually do think that it's connected in some way to the gerontocracy that we are living with, where our top political leaders still come from a time and place where this was different. And we've clung to them for a strangely long time. The oldest boomers and even the people a little older than them, like Joe Biden, who sort of represent the story America tells itself about itself, which is a kind of baby boomer life cycle, right? The 50s are simple, and in the 60s we're teenagers, and then it's all a little anxious, and then we get a mortgage in the 80s, and everything's great in the 90s, and now we're kind of disoriented. That's just what would happen if you're born in 1946, right? That's not reality. That's not true of any of those times. And our leaders were just born in the 40s. Bill Clinton, who entered politics as the epitome of youthful energy, and Donald Trump, who is quite an old man, were born 6 weeks apart in the summer of 1946. George W. Bush, by the way, born between them in that same summer.
Wow.
That's just really weird. And I think it has to do with a certain kind of maybe sclerosis is the word, maybe paralysis is the word, but just a sense that nobody says, well, it's my turn. I'm going to jump in and push you guys out. You had a Republican presidential primary where nobody was willing to say anything about the leading candidate, who they were running against. I think this phase is sort of characterized by that bizarre observational passivity.
That's actually fascinating to think about. I mean, again, tacking back to what you said about the presidency and how it has actually taken on too much meaning in this moment, that it is really supposed to be, in some ways, a clerkish, almost administrative role. I think that one of the things that we're seeing in certain ways that makes it difficult for people to move or to act or to jump in, as you say, is that we look at presidents, at politicians broadly, but especially at presidents as almost an avatar of ourselves, of our beliefs, of our parties. It's not really a role. It's like this person represents me and my self, my political self, but also maybe my broader self, and also represents that self to everyone else. And there's a fear of disrupting that in some sense.
Yeah.
There's an excessive loyalty that can come with that. I don't know. Does that ring true to you?
I think that's a great point. It's a very interesting point. And I think it's one that Woodrow Wilson would really have liked, right? His vision of the presidency is as a kind of embodiment of the will of the American public. Whereas for Madison, the presidency is not even a representative institution because one person couldn't possibly represent a diverse society. The presidency is an administrative job. It's elected because we want that person to be accountable, but not because we imagine that one person could be representative of an entire society. But we've absolutely moved in this direction. I think you're right. And it also helps explain some of the peculiar kind of loyalty that now defines the party coalitions. In an odd way, the parties have become less effective as they've become more internally coherent. You just have to agree in order to be a member of the party, which is not how being a member of a party was understood in American politics, even in the 1990s. When I was a congressional staffer, the parties had really distinct factions, and all the more so further back in our history. There was a sense that parties existed to facilitate a coalition, and members of a coalition don't all think alike. They don't all agree with each other. Ronald Reagan, who's now looked back to as a kind of avatar of a certain sort of 20th century conservatism, he was constantly subject to the most withering kinds of criticism from the right. And this, Franklin Roosevelt was from the left. People thought that his job was ultimately to facilitate the work of their coalition. And if he's going to listen to them, they better make it clear that they are here to criticize him for failing. And now, I do think that to be critical of your own party is seen to be some kind of failure of loyalty, maybe even failure of nerve. I would say it's very hard to negotiate in the absence of intra-party factions. If there aren't people within each party who are a little different than the mainstream and who can therefore work with some of the different people in the other party, it becomes just very difficult to build cross-partisan coalitions. And when negotiation is taken to be surrender, it's just very hard for Congress to do its work. I think all of that has happened, and yeah, these seem like related problems.
Bring back withering criticism. I like that.
Sure. I mean, look, Donald Trump just gave up on the Republican Party's pro-life platform, which had been part of the party platform since 1984.
Remarkable.
No one says a word. There are entire groups whose entire existence is on the basis of their being pro-life advocates, and they feel like they can't afford to criticize this?
That's remarkable. It really is a remarkable moment. I had thought of that, but not in this context, this passivity thing. And I mean, maybe as we come up on an hour and change here, one thing you said is, maybe it's this gerontocracy that is keeping us so sclerotic. And maybe there's something about, another generation just taking the wheel and just in the fact of taking that wheel that re-energizes things, that we're not sort of stuck in that. I mean, I don't know. Let me ask both of you then. How optimistic are you of that being the case? Because I think in the last two questions, we went back and forth a little bit on that feeling of, maybe it is as simple as just that we've gotten ourselves into some sort of weird generational cul-de-sac and that will change. But to your point, Christine, there's something deeply cultural about this kind of feeling of representation as kind of metaphysical actuation rather than representation as, part of this Republican virtue that we're supposed to be cultivating. So I don't know. Let me, let's go around and see how you guys are feeling as we wrap here. What do you think, Christine?
Yeah, I'm not that optimistic. I guess I'm in the middle in that I think obviously a generational change is going to happen because that's what happens. Like, unfortunately, Joe Biden is not going to live forever, as we can all tell at this point. And younger people will come into power and ostensibly make changes. But a thing that I feel like I'm seeing among even younger politicians and politicians in general, and maybe this was to a point that you made a while ago, Yuval, is that many of them don't necessarily see their political roles as congresspeople, senators, president, as, enacting some laws, administering the state, doing a job. Like, when you look at some of these people, it's like they see themselves being president, and that means something entirely different. And so when they enter that role, like, they'll probably try and stay there for the next 50 years too. Again, there's like a separation from this idea of like, oh, this is a job that I'm supposed to do on behalf of other people to this is a personal platform in which maybe I represent the vision, the voice of a generation or something, but I'm also just representing myself and I want to keep it. And I don't really see, I don't totally see that changing. Mm-hmm. I still see that tendency even in younger generations.
Yeah, I'm not an optimist either. I'm a conservative, but I have some hope. I would say that there's a way that our politics would benefit from a kind of middle-aged mindset. We live in a time when older people and younger people are kind of nuts in different ways. And, I say this as a Gen Xer, the greatest generation.
Indeed.
I do think it's time for some people who view the young and the old as their responsibility to think about the future of the country. But am I hopeful that my generation is going to be great at that? I don't think the political leaders of my generation are all that impressive on that front at this point. Now, look, political talent sometimes arises out of nowhere, and you'll end up with someone who we now have never heard of, in 5 or 6 years being a pivotal public figure. But at the moment, I think the generational transition, which has begun, and it has begun in Congress, we have seen both parties in the House move from leaders born in the 40s to leaders born in the 60s, I guess, maybe 70s actually in the House. The difference is not great. And the mentality about the nature of politics, I think, is not fundamentally different. And maybe in some ways it is worse because it takes this moment to be normal, which I don't think Nancy Pelosi did. I think we're going to see a transition like that in the Senate too, and we'll see. There are some impressive people in our politics, but I would say at this moment, almost all of them are governors. Governorships do still require people to pretend to be normal, which I think is very important about politics. to be governor of most states, you have to basically seem like a normal person, and that encourages you to be a normal person. It selects for that. And I think in both parties now, governors are the only tolerable politicians. And so I hope that in thinking about future presidents, we look to governors and not to Congress. I think our best presidents have generally been former governors in the last 50 years or so. But yeah, am I hopeful? I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic.
No. Well, I mean, I think the way to really end it is a little cliche, but really, Yuval, the book is terrific, and I do really think that your core point in the book that just studying and approaching these problems that the Constitution both embodies and tries to solve, would get us at least part of the way to a more optimistic future. The book's called American Covenant: How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. Yuval, thanks a lot.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks.